Alright, so today I will be teaching you the activity number 3. Let's do this. Student activity 2.6 Protein Synthesis. Fill up the table with the nitrogenous bases when the DNA is replicated, transcribed, and translated. On the last column, supply the amino acid coded by the mRNA. Use the genetic code below. So, we will not be using this table, obviously, because the answer would be given out. Instead, we'll be using this table. So, we all know in the previous lesson that both DNA and RNA have corresponding nitrogenous bases. In DNA, A corresponds to T and C corresponds to G, while in RNA, A corresponds to U and C corresponds to G. Alright? So, in the first column, the order of bases in DNA is already given, which is TGT. The replication in DNA is going to be the one that we're going to solve for. So based on DNA right here, we will be using this formula since it's DNA. So now, from TGT, T, we will be going over with the corresponding complementary pairs. So from T in this formula, it corresponds to A. And G corresponds to, of course, C. T corresponds to A again. Now this time, the third column is given to us, which is the transcription order of bases in mRNA or in the codon. So the code here is UGU. The genetic information is UGU. So based on this, since it's already given, this uses the RNA formula, which is A corresponds to U and C corresponds to G. For the fourth column, the translation order of bases in tRNA or the anticodon, we will be using RNA formula, since of course it's tRNA and mRNA. So these codons will be using the RNA formula. So U corresponds to A. G, of course, corresponds to C. And U corresponds to A again. So next, we will be figuring out the amino acids. Use the codon in mRNA. There's your clue right there. We will be using this row, or this column specifically, in order to find the amino acids. So, since UGU is given here, we will be finding the amino acids through the genetic code listed below. So, the code is UGU. So we will be finding the first letter, which is U. Find the U in the four of these. So there's the U. Second letter is G. So we will be finding the second letter through the above, which is G. So U and G, we will be crossing out this part. And the final letter is U, which there's 4 rows right here. We will be going through this, U, G, and U. So that corresponds to cysteine or cysteine. So that's our amino acid for this particular codon, cysteine. Now for the next row, ATT. For the replication DNA, of course, we will be using the DNA formula. A corresponds to T, T corresponds to A, and T corresponds to A again. After that, solving for the third column now. So in order to solve this, we will be basing it off of the second column, or the one that's nearest to it. Since the third column is going to be RNA, and the second column is DNA, we have to substitute for everything that corresponds to the T and the U difference between the two formulas. So T corresponds to the RNA here, which is still A. A corresponds to U. It's U because we're using the RNA formula in this column. This column, on the other hand, will be using the DNA column. So translating this the A becomes the U instead of the T. A becomes U again, based on here. So the fourth column is going to be the anticodon. That's going to be much easier since we have something to base it upon, and it uses the same formula, which is RNA. So A corresponds to U corresponds to A, and U corresponds to A again. So now, the amino acids. We will be using the codon in the third column, or the mRNA, listed here below. So now, our codon is AUU. So we'll be finding the first letter, which is A, U, second letter, and the final letter is U. AU is column U. That all aligns to this box right here, which U aligns to the isoleucine, as given right here, AUU. So the amino acid is isoleucine. Next one. So the 2 here in this column has no order of bases in DNA. But don't worry, because it's going to be the same conversion from this and this. Since this uses DNA formula, we'll be using that to convert this DNA to this DNA. So C corresponds to G right here, A corresponds to T, and C corresponds to G again. Same with the first column. T corresponds to A with the DNA formula, C corresponds to G, and G corresponds to C. Now next, the codon. We'll be basing it off again from the DNA to RNA conversion. Keep in mind of substitution. So C corresponds to G, A corresponds to U, C corresponds to G, and after that, so on. With this one, T corresponds to A, T corresponds to G, and G corresponds to C. Now the anticodon. This is going to be much easier since we're going to base it off of the codons. So G is going to be C, U is going to be A, G is going to be C. A becomes U, G becomes C, and C becomes G. Alright. So the final ones are going to be the amino acids right here. We'll be basing it off in the third column, or in the codon, G, U, G. So G, U, and then G. Right here, G, U, and G. Goes through here, which corresponds to GUG valine. So valine will be put right here. Next is AGC. A, G, and C. That corresponds to this line. Or no, wait, AGC. So that corresponds to this line. The serine, or serine. AGC. Well, that's the amino acids. Next, we have a given codon between the 2 columns right here, or between the 2 rows. We have the given codon, and we have the given amino acids, which, of course, if you want to check, we're going to check A, C, and U. This becomes threonine, which is in the given right here. So CGA is next. CGA, which corresponds to arginine, which is given right here. It's a common reviewing principle. So in order to get 2 sides, we're going to base it off of the codons. So ACU, we're going to be RNA to RNA conversion. ACU, so A is going to become U, C becomes G, U becomes A. C becomes G, G becomes C, and A becomes U. This time, we're going to be using RNA to DNA, which is right here. So A becomes T, C becomes G, then U becomes A. Next, we got C becomes G, G becomes C, and then A becomes T. Now, for the first column, going to be easy, of course. We're going to take the T of the DNAs. T corresponds to A, G corresponds to C, A corresponds to T. Next is G corresponds to C, C corresponds to G, T corresponds to A. Now for the last one, we are given the codon and no amino acid. So what I want to do here is to get the amino acid first based on the codon. So U, C, U. First letter is U, second letter is C, and last letter is U, which corresponds to serine again. U, C, U. Now, after we gotten all of that, it's going to be the same process as the last row right here. So, U, of course, from RNA conversion. U corresponds to A, C corresponds to G, U corresponds to A again. For this one, DNA to RNA or RNA to DNA. So U corresponds to A, C corresponds to G, and then U corresponds to A again. Using this, we're going to convert it to DNA. A corresponds to T, G corresponds to C, and A corresponds to T again. And that's all for our discussion. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you passed the quiz. See you around next time.